Welcome, everyone. Today's webinar is to provide an introduction to the topic of K-12 competency-based education, and the webinar is hosted by the Aurora Institute. It's part of our CompetencyWorks initiative, which is an online resource for K-12 competency-based education. We appreciate you joining us in these extraordinary times. We believe that competency-based education strategies will be very beneficial for students both now, during the pandemic, and also in the future. Please know that this webinar is being recorded and will be available soon on the Aurora Institute website. Please notice the chat box in the lower left of your screen, which you can use by typing into the bar at the bottom. And we invite you to use the chat box to introduce yourself, such as your name, location, organization, and any work you're doing in competency-based education. I'm Eliot Levine, and switching slides. I'm Eliot Levine, and Susan Patrick, Damarr Smith, and I will be leading today's webinar. Susan Patrick is the president and CEO of the Aurora Institute and the founder of CompetencyWorks. She leads our organization's efforts to advance the transformation of the education system toward personalized competency-based education. I'm the Aurora Institute's research director, and I lead our CompetencyWorks initiative. I was also a teacher in 2 high schools that use many of the approaches we'll be discussing today. And we're very fortunate to be joined today by Damarr Smith, who is the project manager of competency-based education for the Chicago Public Schools. And we're greatly looking forward to hearing Damarr tell us about Illinois' pilot program and the strategies they're using in Chicago. We welcome you again to introduce yourself in the chat box, and thanks to everyone who's already done that. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to type questions or comments you have into the chat box. And at the end of the webinar, we'll be inviting you to share 2 things in the chat box. First is one step you want to take toward deeper competency-based education in your own school or district or organization. And second is any resources or supports that would help you do that. So I encourage you to think about that during the webinar. Today's webinar is meant to give you a broad overview of competency-based education, which some school districts also call mastery-based or proficiency-based education, and we use those terms interchangeably. We'll be talking about why we need to change our current system, the great advances that have already happened across the country, and strategies we can use to transform our schools and the education system as a whole. We'll also be sharing resources you can use to go deeper in your own schools and organizations, and we want you to know that there's a system of resources and organizations and policies that can support your efforts based on lessons learned from schools that have been doing this work for many years. So what is competency-based education? That's a complex question, which is why the Aurora Institute worked with more than 100 experts in the field to develop our original definition 8 years ago, and then an updated definition last year. I'll review the 7 elements of the definition briefly now to give you a sense of what we'll be talking about today, and then during the webinar we'll circle back and unpack some of the parts. You can also consult the report that's shown here for more in-depth information. And all of the resources we'll be showing today are available on our website. The first element focuses on student agency because learning sciences research and the experience of many educators tells us that students learn more when they're able to make important decisions about their own learning experiences, and when they have the opportunity to create and apply knowledge rather than being passive recipients. Second, assessments can't only be about grading students. It needs to be meaningful, positive, and empowering, and it needs to provide information that can guide next steps for both students and teachers. In competency-based schools, students receive timely, differentiated supports based on their individual learning needs. And this means that all students receive differentiated supports, not just some students. Students also progress based on demonstrating their mastery, not based on how much time they've spent in a classroom. And they learn actively using different pathways and varied pacing, so there's not only one route to demonstrating proficiency. The quality principles shown here on the right is another essential resource if you're trying to go deeper on all of the ideas we're talking about today. The next element is about equity, and we believe that creating a competency-based education system is an essential part of eliminating the deep inequities in our education system. That's why the definition states clearly that strategies to ensure equity for all students are embedded in the culture, structure, and pedagogy of competency-based systems. The report here, the report shown here on the right goes into much greater depth on this topic and how to implement changes in your school. Finally, rigorous common expectations for learning knowledge, skills, and dispositions are explicit, transparent, measurable, and transferable. There's a lot there, and we'll unpack it more later. And now I'll turn it back over to Susan.
Thanks, Eliot. It's important that that 7-part definition, that all 7 elements are included in a true competency-based system. Now we're going to take a look at a national overview. How is competency-based education advancing across the U.S.? Back in 2012, when we first launched CompetencyWorks, there were about a dozen states that had created some flexibility from seat time for competency-based education, credit flexibility, and the red states are advanced state policies. You can see that by 2019, we had 49 states that had advancing policies. But this doesn't mean that implementations of competency-based education are uniformly across all districts and all states. It is taking hold in pockets, and we estimate that 6 to 8% of public school districts across the U.S. are beginning to implement competency-based education models. So it's an exciting development that's taking hold across the U.S. We're also thinking about why do we need to change the system from the traditional system of learning to one that is a competency-based system. Districts and schools are getting started in moving towards competency-based education for many reasons. But one of the key areas, and this is one of the areas that the working definition for competency-based education was updated in 2019, was a focus on equity, focusing on ensuring all students learn and achieve high levels of mastery, that they're demonstrating their learning and having opportunities for deeper learning, that students have more personalized activities and opportunities to learn based on their interests, that learning is tailored towards their needs, and also an eye towards global competitiveness. What are world-class education systems around the globe doing? They are focusing on high levels of mastery of skills and knowledge, of academic knowledge. The other, and we'll be covering this later, is addressing the flaws of the current system, the current structures that rank and sort kids, that leave some kids behind or with huge gaps in their learning. And certainly today, we're seeing that with the current crisis in coronavirus or COVID-19, the difficulty in meeting students where they are, in knowing where students are in their learning progressions, this is another reason that districts and schools turn to competency-based education. We want to ensure we know where every student is every day in their learning to support them to the same common high expectations for all students, to ensure equity, and that we have equity strategies in place will require shifts in the structures towards competency-based structures. We'll have shifts in pedagogy to instructional models that meet students where they are, but also inspire student empowerment and student agency, and also create a culture where all students learn and are held to high levels of learning. So Eliot, back to you to dig in deeper on these 10 flaws of the traditional system.
Thanks, Susan. So it really helps to understand competency-based education if we start by talking about some flaws of the traditional model. And many schools and educators have already made some important shifts, but the traditional model is still mostly in place in most American schools. And that model was developed at a very different time in history, and it wasn't designed to ensure that all students could be prepared with the full set of skills they need for their future. So the traditional system focuses on a narrow set of mostly academic outcomes, and we'll discuss how a competency-based system focuses on a broader set of outcomes. Second, the traditional system is based on a fixed mindset, which assumes that not all students have strong potential, and unsurprisingly, that mindset can hurt student outcomes. The traditional system also tends to be bureaucratic and organized around compliance, which makes it harder for teachers to personalize what they do to the needs of individual students. And it has high levels of variability in terms of expectations for student learning across different teachers and schools and zip codes, and those differences create inequities. The opaque learning objectives in many schools mean that students don't really know what they're supposed to be learning or how to improve. They might just get a grade but not have a clear sense of what they need to do next. And you can see the issue of grading practices with mixed messages and misleading signals if you think about the huge number of students who get high grades in high school but then need to do remedial coursework in college. And those students have often been misled about their actual level of mastery, not in any malicious way, but in many cases it's because their grades in academic subjects have been inflated due to their good behavior or strong class participation. When we say that the traditional system is time-based, we mean that students often advance to the next grade or course after a predetermined amount of time, like a semester or a year, even if they haven't mastered the material yet. And you also have the opposite situation where many students are required to continue in a course even after they've already mastered the material. In the traditional system, extra supports are mostly targeted to students whose needs are well above or below the norm, but the large group of students in the middle typically don't get as much of those supports. And finally, the traditional system emphasizes summative assessments of what students know, but it doesn't give enough attention to formative assessments that help students move forward in their learning. Before getting deeper into what competency-based education is, just two quick comments about what it isn't, based on a couple of common misconceptions. First, it's not simply working through an online curriculum with students progressing at their own pace. That's not what we mean when we say competency-based education. And it's not just moving quickly through a checklist of activities at shallow levels. It's about demonstrating deeper learning and the ability to apply what you've learned. Now I'd like to talk about what competency-based education is, starting with aspects of its purpose and culture. So competency-based districts and schools make a commitment to be responsible for all students mastering learning expectations. They decide that they're going to keep on growing and changing until every student is learning. Second, competency-based education focuses on a broad set of outcomes that prepare students for college, career, and lifelong learning. And these outcomes, of course, include academic knowledge, although with an emphasis on deeper learning. And they also include skills and dispositions that students need in order to apply their knowledge in new contexts and to manage their own learning. These could be skills and dispositions such as self-direction, collaboration, social-emotional skills, and others. And districts and schools also work hard to create cultures that are more empowering and inclusive. The idea is that when schools are less bureaucratic and everyone feels valued, students and adults are more likely to take steps to improve their learning and to improve the school. Now, when we talk about pedagogy, it's important to note that there's not a single prescribed learning approach for competency-based education, but there are some practices that you'll see across settings that are doing strong implementation. The first is that all students receive timely and differentiated instruction and support, not just the students who are most challenged or most advanced. And that's typically done by providing some type of flex time when students can go and work with the teachers they need to get help from. Second, competency-based schools are committed to pedagogy that's informed by the learning sciences. And that means providing learning opportunities that are targeted to students' current level of competency. It also means recognizing when there are gaps and addressing them quickly so students are making strong progress and don't get disengaged or demoralized. And third, assessments are embedded in a personalized learning cycle and aligned to the broader set of learning outcomes that I mentioned on the last slide. This means that students have multiple opportunities to demonstrate mastery. They don't all take the same assessments at the same time and in the same order. And many assessments are also performance-based, where students are showing that they can apply what they've learned and that they're developing important personal success skills. And finally, there are some structural pieces. The first is transparent expectations of what students should learn, what proficiency looks like, and how each student is progressing. And these types of transparency are essential if we want to help students take ownership of their learning, and also if we want adults to be able to see what's working and what support students need. Next are strategies for communicating progress that support learning and success. And again, this involves a greater emphasis on formative assessments and communicating clearly how a student is progressing and what supports they need to move forward. And it's important to note that competency-based schools do use summative assessments, but they're used in a balanced way along with other important forms of assessment. Learners advance when they demonstrate mastery, not after a predetermined amount of time. And the pathways are personalized based on the student's needs and preferences, which might mean needing different supports or demonstrating mastery in different ways. And finally, there are mechanisms in place to increase consistency across teachers and across schools about what constitutes mastery. And this can happen by teachers looking at student work together, and there are great calibration protocols that schools use to do this. And these are called calibration and moderation processes. So that's a quick overview. And each of these issues could, of course, be a large discussion by themselves, which is why we showed you some key resources to go deeper on earlier slides, and we'll be showing more resources later. And Susan, I'll turn back to you.
Thanks, Eliot. I'm going to highlight some of the differences between personalized learning and competency-based education, and then do a quick snapshot of state policies that help support work in K-12 competency-based education. So sometimes the terms personalized learning and competency-based education are used interchangeably, but we think it's important as a field to get really clear on what we mean when we use these terms because it affects the quality of the implementations. Well, Eliot just went into deep details on competency-based education as a system and structures that really ensure clear expectations, clear goal settings, common expectations for all students, and consistency in how we grade and evaluate proficiency through calibration, through moderation practices. These structures are really important. When you think about personalized learning, we developed this field-based definition by surveying over 1,000 educators working in personalized learning environments across the country. And personalized learning is per person, per student. It's about tailoring learning for each student's strengths, needs, and interests, and enabling voice and choice in what, how, when, and where they learn, still providing flexibility and support, but ensuring mastery. This is the tie-in with a mastery-based or competency-based system. We are getting all students to high levels of learning of the highest standards. Consistently, we're holding all students to the highest standards for equity. And so when we think of, there was a Spanish researcher named Victor Garcia Holt in the 1970s who published over 40 books on personalized learning. He describes it as a learner's journey to developing their freedom of choice. So when you have competency-based structures, it really gives you the ability to open up explorations of deeper learning with students per person in personalized approaches. So personalized learning and competency-based education systems and structures go hand in hand. They work together. Without competency-based education, then we worry that personalized learning may result in variable outcomes and achievement, just like it does in the current system when a grading is not calibrated. Without personalization, it's unlikely that all students will reach the same high outcomes that we expect in competency-based education. It is critical that we meet students where they are and that we tie in students' goal settings with their personal interests, passions, and tailor learning for them. So let's shift from practice to policies. Across the United States, what policies are helping to catalyze competency-based education systems in districts and schools? There are different entry points, and you can see on the left of this is a continuum for state leadership in advancing competency-based education. For states getting started, a first step is often to set a portrait of a graduate or new definitions of success that are more holistic for the whole child. That includes a broader set of competencies and skills and habits of success, as well as the core areas of subject knowledge and expertise. Then there are states that set up innovation zones to allow the coalition of the willing districts to come together. They usually apply for some innovation zone status and are free to innovate. The school leaders, the educators that are working on competency-based systems will flag policies that get in their way at the state level, and the state commits to being more of an engine of innovation and removing some of those compliance-driven, maybe outdated regulations that they can help open up space for innovation. In addition, moving away from seat time to being able to redefine our credits based on the awarding of competencies or building up of competencies in a given domain for knowledge and skills, as well as to open up multiple pathways for graduation, multiple pathways for learning. So states moving forward are rethinking their graduate profiles. They're rethinking about what it means to have a meaningful credential. There are states that have worked on mastery-based transcripts or proficiency-based diplomas. We're seeing some states explore performance assessment and more balanced systems of assessments, moving away from traditional one-size-fits-all assessments, trying to create more space for competency-based assessments with more evidence for learning. And we're seeing a drive for our educator workforce and modernizing our educator workforce to become more skilled in personalized learning, competency-based approaches, as well as diversifying our educator workforce to model and to reflect the population of the youth that are served in our K-12 schools. There are also state initiatives to build local capacity, such as competency-based education pilots and initiatives. We're starting to see colleges of ed support teacher training for competency-based systems, like in Southern New Hampshire University. States that are taking a comprehensive approach include states like New Hampshire that are trying to work on next-gen accountability systems with their PACE or performance assessment for competency-based ed. That is one of the innovative assessment pilots in the country, and more comprehensive statewide approaches. So there are many places where state policy is advancing to create more space for personalized competency-based systems. Let's take a moment to pause, and if you have any questions, to type your questions in the chat box. How is personalized learning different from constructivism? Elliot, I'm looking at this question from Valerie. I didn't know if you wanted to address it or if you want me to jump in. Want me to turn it over to you on this first question?
I'm fine either way, Susan.
Great. Go ahead.
Oh, sure. So I think that both constructivism and personalized learning come from a progressive tradition that include elements that you might find in both, such as I saw somebody comment before, I think it was Derek, about the importance of performance-based assessment, the type of work where students are creating and applying their own knowledge, where the learning is personalized to the needs of the individual. I'm not sure if I could give as deep a definition of constructivism as I can of competency-based education, so I may be missing some points, but Susan, if there's anything you'd like to add.
Yeah, I think the tie between ensuring that the learning goals and objectives are very clear and the outcomes that are defined are very clear and that all students are held to the same outcome versus just allowing a student-centered approach may vary. I think that that's an important distinction. Let me jump in there. There's another question from Maria Galindo. How can we convince school administrators that these features, slides 17 and 18, need a rethinking of school schedules? It's clear these changes need great organizational skills. Elliot, do you want to jump in on that one too? I know that the schedules are one of the last things that we need to change as schools and districts move to competency-based education.
As came up in a previous comment, everything is so interconnected. So much of convincing school administrators that these features need a rethinking of school schedules takes you back several steps to a bigger question where the community asks, what kind of education do we want for our students? And Susan was mentioning that a minute ago in relation to graduate profiles. Some of the other ways that communities look around and say, I'm noticing that our graduates are not leaving us ready for the world. And why is that? And what can we do about it? We find that that discussion and that observation often leads people to competency-based education. And once you're there, you end up encountering all kinds of questions about what that means for the structure of schools. One of the things it means in almost all cases is a substantial rethinking of school schedules and spaces and all kinds of things. And I'll say that one of the best ways to convince school administrators and other stakeholders within your system of the importance of any of these changes is to help them see all of the great examples of how other schools engaged in this work are already doing that. Many schools do that by visiting other competency-based schools. We'll be showing a resource later that lists a large number of other schools doing this work. And also there's a tremendous amount of resources on this topic, specifically one that I can think of around rethinking school schedules. I can't tell you what it's called, but I can tell you where to find it on the CompetencyWorks blog, and it's in a slide that's coming up in a little while. But there's tremendous writing and thinking and doing that's already been done around school schedules.
And then one more quick question before we go to Damarr's amazing presentation coming up, which is from Matt Bryant. How is competency-based education different from a teacher using standards-based grading in their own classroom? Do you want to touch on that, Eliot?
Sure. It's not different. Standards-based grading is an element of competency-based education. And so the grading practices that we're talking about with having transparent competencies and having students be able to tell where they are in terms of progress in order to be able to get feedback and know what their next steps are. Standards-based grading is very compatible with that. It often, and standards is another word that's often used interchangeably with competencies, although as you dig deeper into this, you'll see that people make fine distinctions. But what we're really talking about are grading practices that make it really clear what competencies students are aiming to achieve and what some of the sub-standards or learning targets or objectives within that are. And so standards-based grading typically uses levels such as haven't yet shown enough evidence, are approaching showing the right amount of evidence, have met the standard, you're exceeding the standard. And students show in multiple ways typically how they have achieved mastery in that area. But so standards-based grading fits in very well with competency-based education.
And we see a number of other questions. We'll work on responding to these questions in the chat room, and there's also time for more Q&A at the end. I'm eager to move ahead and learn about the work in competency-based education in Chicago Public Schools. Please join me in welcoming Damarr Smith.
Thank you so much, Susan and Eliot. I am so excited to share some of the great work that's been happening at Chicago Public Schools. Right here you see a slide with me in it, a number of other school leaders that are really responsible on the ground for getting this work underway. And so I would be remiss to have this presentation and talk about this work without mentioning them and shouting them out, because they are the ones that make this possible. So what I'm going to talk about today is the fact that context matters. So you'll get a sense of the context for Chicago Public Schools and for the Illinois state pilot that allows for us to implement competency-based education. I want to harp on something that Eliot mentioned early on, that there isn't one way to approach this, and so keep that in mind as you're listening to this presentation, and maybe some things may pop up that resonate. But there definitely are a number of different approaches to this work. The fact that there is a need for balance in terms of alignment and autonomy. For us, we have very different and unique schools that are piloting this work, and we want to make sure that we have flexibility with how schools approach this, and then the role that central office can play. So from a state context, there are 852 districts in Illinois and 47 districts that are piloting competency-based education, and Chicago Public Schools is one of the 47. Right? We have been working together over the last 2 years, supporting each other, hearing about what is happening. I would actually say 3 years, hearing about what is happening at each district and learning from each other and supporting along the way. So all this work is possible through the Illinois State Board of Education's pilot and the Post-Secondary Workforce Readiness Act that was passed in July of 2016. And we started planning in 2017, 2018, and now all of our schools are piloting and implementing competency-based education at Chicago Public Schools. So here is just a list of the schools that are participating in the pilot. Right? They're all high schools, very unique, and all piloting somewhat differently as you look at the scope of implementation. Right? The first cohort of schools were six schools that were piloting competency-based education, and the second cohort has 4 schools, and we have selected enrollment schools, neighborhood schools, a school that's in a county jail, a school that supports students with special needs. So there's a lot of variety, and we want to make sure that our model supports that level of variety and uniqueness to each school. Also recognizing that schools are different in size, right? So some of our schools, we have one school that has close to 3,000 students, right? And then we have schools that are much smaller. So we want to keep that in mind as we put together and set forth a model for this work. So the overall context for Chicago Public Schools is right now we have a 5-year goal, right? That started in 2019, and you can see some of those goals on this particular slide. We want 90% of our freshmen to be able to graduate, to be on track, and we want 90% of our students to graduate within 5 years, 50% of our students to reach college readiness benchmarks, and 78% of our students to graduate and enroll in college by 2024. Right? And this is all aligned with our focus for college readiness for competency-based education, and our CPS core values are strewn through all of the work that we do at Chicago Public Schools and with the competency-based education pilot in particular. So what is CBE to us, right? It's giving students multiple paths, multiple ways to show proficiency, multiple opportunities to demonstrate mastery. We want to make sure that we're giving them the opportunity to move at their own pace and support interventions and provide support interventions when needed, right? Eliot talked about that a little bit earlier, that we want to make sure that we're differentiating for each student and recognizing the needs of each student. And this really binds us together as we talk about equity of our work in our district and the pilot in general. So how we also look at the pilot is we want to make sure that we're focusing on academic competencies and adaptive competencies. So there are 2 sets for us. Right? The academic competencies are like numeracy and literacy and writing and things of that nature. And the adaptive competencies are more aligned some of the things that aligned with some of the things that Eliot mentioned as well. So agency and self-direction, those 21st century skills and social emotional skills as well. So we want to make sure that we're tackling both. And when we're talking about the whole child and supporting the whole child and being student-centered, this is really what it's all about. So as I mentioned, there isn't one way to approach this, right? And so there isn't. And here are a couple of, 5 initiatives that we've been focusing on at the district level to support schools as they implement competency-based education. And as you will see, right, not all of our schools are doing every bit of the initiatives that we focused on. And that's fine. You know, that's totally fine. We want them to be able to jump in where they feel comfortable right now, right? Extended learning is one of our key initiatives, and we started that last year, and we have 4 schools that are doing that work right now, and we feel like that is totally aligned with academic excellence and equity. And as we go down the slide, we have extended learning and enrichment and acceleration opportunities for students as well, and about 3 of our schools are participating in that work. We hope to increase that this year. One school in particular is focusing on increased dual enrollment opportunities, which is obviously a huge part of competency-based education. And then, as a district, at the central office level, we really want to make sure that we're providing the supports that are necessary for schools to really effectively integrate SEL within their school model, and that really aligns to our adaptive competency work that I mentioned earlier. And so for us, we want to make sure that all of our schools are participating in SEL integration by 2021. So SEL is essentially working on and supporting students in their social emotional learning, social awareness, self-awareness, responsible decision-making, which also is aligned to adaptive competencies where we focus on agency and self-direction. So I just really want to call that out. Adaptive pacing is our foundation for a lot of our work. So we were able to do this through a steering committee of school leaders that came together to have the conversation about what are the key elements of competency-based education. And through this work, all of our schools are implementing some aspect of the adaptive pacing tool. And this is the tool. We created it last year with the steering committee. As I said, 2 leaders from each school got together, and I asked that question: what does competency-based education look like? If we step into a classroom, what should we expect to see? And then we keyed in on these 7 areas: learning environment, clear shared learning outcomes, multiple learning pathways, student agency, performance-based assessment that was mentioned earlier, practice and feedback, and supports and interventions and extensions that students need. And so this allowed us to align, right, and be on the same page, but also give for the autonomy that is needed for schools to decide which area that they wanted to focus on. And as you can see, there are different descriptors, indicators, I would say. We were able to do this work with Great Schools Partnership, a leader nationally in competency-based education, which really involved just making this document more concise. A school leader from the district took on this work over the summer, and we were very grateful for her dedication to making this happen. And so for schools, they could decide to maybe just focus on practice and feedback and one indicator within practice and feedback, or focus entirely on performance-based assessment. That is the level of autonomy we want for schools to be able to utilize. So what other role can central office play? So through that work, what I just talked about, the adaptive pacing tool, we were able to find funding to bring on a CBE fellow to help create this document or make it more concise over the summer. We were able to bring on a consultant to help us think through those 7 key elements. And external funding is really important as well. As you transition to competency-based education, there are a lot of needed resources that teachers are going to need to have. As well as what we've been focusing on is moving barriers to innovation and helping schools set guidelines and expectations for competency-based education. So SEL integration, social emotional learning, we were able to get that funding through collective impact, very much aligned to our core values at CTS, community partnership. We worked with Thrive Chicago and communities and schools to put together a grant to fund skill growth in students and in leaders, like teachers or out of school time leaders, for students to be able to, or young people to be able to build these social emotional skills. How we've been leveraging that for Chicago Public Schools is now we have an SEL integration specialist, Tanya Howell, who's doing amazing work, and she is training teachers to be able to do this work within the classroom. So lastly, I feel like this is another area in which we've been able to leverage funds, right, for better student outcomes. And this slide harps on what I talked about earlier, summer extended learning, and the fact that we have 4 schools that did that work last year, and we hope to open that up to more schools this year, especially as we consider our current landscape with the pandemic. Right. There's a lot of information on this slide, and I'm going to try to break it down. Essentially, this school has 1,700 students in it, and this is the mass calculated amount of grades that those 1,700 students have, right? Over 11,000 grades, right? By the end of semester 1, 85% of those grades were proficient. And when you think about competency-based education, as you give students more time, they show proficiency because they start to grasp exactly what is needed, and they get the differentiation and support that is needed as well. So by second semester, we had about 90% of students or grades that were proficient. But those students still needed extra time, right? And this is where that aspect of moving barriers so you can innovate. Well, this school in particular had been doing this similar work for a couple of years, recognizing that students needed extra time. But we were able to allow for this to happen in more schools where they allotted extra time to students to show proficiency. And through that work, by July, 94% of those grades were proficient, which meant for this particular school, 92% of their students their freshmen were on track. And this is really important because, you know, as you think about even what summer school looks like or summer extended learning looks like, for a proficiency-based or competency-based education model, that may mean student has a week extra to do the work or 2 extra weeks. It's really dependent upon that student's ability to finish work and complete that work in a given amount of time. So lastly, I want to say this is a way that we've been thinking about this work. And you may not be able to see this slide very well, but as we've continued to do competency-based education, more schools have expressed interest in participating. And now what we want to do is make sure that schools are thinking through their why. Why do they want to do competency-based education? And maybe you're thinking about implementing at your school or at your district or at your state. That is an important question to ask. Like, how is this connected to your mission? How is this connected to your vision? How does this solve an equity challenge within your district or within your school? Those are really important questions to ask because this is not easy work, right? And I definitely don't have all the answers to all the questions, but this is not easy work, but it's necessary. It's needed, especially at a time like this, where students really should be focusing on what's most important. We should also be concentrating on their social, emotional needs as well. And so I just wanted you to keep that in mind and maybe ask those questions as you continue to consider whether you want to do competency-based education at your school, at your district, whatever that context is for you.
Eric, thank you so much. It was really inspirational and informative. Did I just say your name wrong? Damarr?
It's okay.
I apologize for that. Damarr, thank you so much. And it's so important for us all to hear about how so many schools in Chicago and across Illinois have really launched into this work and the great progress that you've made so far. So thank you so much for taking the time to share that with us. We're going to have some time for more Q&A in a few minutes. And if you have questions for Damarr, please enter them in the chat box. And Damarr, if you see questions in the chat box that you feel would be illuminating for us to hear about in relation to what's happening in Chicago, that would be terrific. Before we move into that next Q&A period, we want to share some of the many resources that are available to support your transformation to competency-based education. And we'll mention the Aurora Institute website, which has publications on a wide range of policy and practice issues. Some of our most recent ones are shown here, including reports on equity and quality and professional development and assessment and state and federal policy and many others. We also have 2 very active blogs that share trends and analysis and lessons learned in practice and policy. And you can, of course, visit them on our website or subscribe to our newsletters to get updates about new blog posts and other resources we have. These images are from our CompetencyWorks blog, and the one on the left is from the Aurora Institute's annual strategic reflection, where we take a look at progress and trends in the field. And the reason I wanted to show it here is that it also shows new publications from many other organizations who are also doing fantastic work in advancing competency-based education. So we hope you'll also look at those and get to know the many different resources that are available to you. And you could hear from Damarr's presentation how many of these partners, like he mentioned, the Great Schools Partnership, and there are so many others who are working very closely with districts who are making these shifts. The image on the right is from one of our most popular blog posts, which brings together about 200 of our articles from visits to schools all over the country, and it's organized by state, so it can help you find competency-based schools in your state or nearby that you can visit or offer as examples to your local stakeholders. And we often hear from, Kentucky or any state, oh, it's so great to be able to point to other schools in Kentucky or Tennessee that, there's something about that being local, which local stakeholders, unsurprisingly, often find very compelling. So we hope the webinar has gotten you thinking about possible next steps for your school or district or organization, and also what supports or resources would help you accomplish that. So if you have some thoughts about that, we invite you to enter them into the chat box, which I think will be helpful to others who are on the call, and it will also be very helpful to us at the Aurora Institute and the field as we continue working to support you. So please feel free to enter into the chat box any next steps or resources you need that occurred to you during the call. And while you're doing that, we're going to use the remainder of our time to respond to other questions that you've typed into the chat box. And why don't we pause for a second, and I need to catch up on questions. Susan or Damarr, perhaps you have some in mind?
Sure. I think there are two overarching questions that I've seen run throughout and would encourage other attendees that have been working in competency-based education to join in responding. One is on teacher training. Where do you find resources for educator professional learning for competency-based education systems? The other question is around what technologies are used to track mastery of competencies, and there have been some good responses there with Summit and with Empower is used in a number of districts, with Canvas, with Jump Rope. On the educator training, it's been really interesting to see across the country local partnerships form and some regional partnerships. In New Hampshire, the New Hampshire Learning Initiative offers professional development for educators in New Hampshire and beyond to learn how to move to competency-based education. Bob Marzano and Marzano Research Labs, Doug Finn, who is an early innovator in competency-based education, offers professional learning. I mentioned Southern New Hampshire University. Westminster, Colorado, has a local partnership with a community college to provide a alternative teacher licensure. So they have been working with instructional aides, many of which who are homegrown graduates of Westminster High School, to come in and then to have students that have actually experienced competency-based education models go through that special licensure program in partnership. So we'd love to hear from your experiences with where you have received professional development for competency-based education. Damarr, let me turn that to you. How are your educators getting the professional learning experiences to make this shift? Is it something that you're doing locally in Chicago Public Schools in your local district? Are there other resources?
Yeah, I think we've been trying to leverage as much as we possibly could. I actually went to the INACOL conference before it was the Aurora Institute. I think that's one way to learn. Went to the Westminster conference as well and learned a great deal from them. They've been doing competency-based education for over 10 years and brought a number of our school leaders to that event. And that was the picture that you saw in the beginning of the slides. I think another way is obviously, I mean, there are great books that have been written on competency-based education. Rose Colby has a very good book. Karen Hess talks about assessment. So I think, just kind of having those opportunities to read and learn from folks that have done the work already. And we've been doing that, like having those opportunities to get together, learn together, talk about the work. And the professional development more so has been on social-emotional learning and adaptive competencies, and we're going to extend that to include performance-based assessment, professional development very soon.
I think also a number of schools and districts that want to deepen their teachers' knowledge of implementation of competency-based education have partnered with local colleges. I'm thinking of Northern Cass School District in North Dakota, who partnered with, I think it was North Dakota State University, and dozens of their teachers were able to both advance the school's work in competency-based education while earning a master's degree in collaboration with a local college. So I think that there's real potential for developing those types of partnerships wherever you are. Right. Let's see what other questions we have.
There's another question on elementary schools and what competency-based education looks like in elementary schools. Eliot, that's coming in. We have strong feelings in our program in our schools. Every school has win times. This is from Melanie. We still have students that need additional time to master learning targets and would not be prepared to move on in that transition to middle school level. What are schools doing in these cases?
Sure. As far as elementary school goes, one thing I can say what it looks like at the elementary level is exceptionally uplifting. The schools that I visited recently, such as Harrisburg Journey Elementary School in Harrisburg, South Dakota, the students, even as young as second grade, are taking a very high level of responsibility for their own learning and being super reflective about where they are and what they need to do next. And it obviously doesn't happen overnight. There's a progression that schools go through of helping students begin to understand what next steps are and how to track them, and having daily conferences. And this one wing of the Journey Elementary School in Harrisburg, they have a multi-age setup where there's no explicit distinctions across grade levels. The second, third, fourth, and fifth graders spend their entire mornings together, intermixed depending on where they are in learning different competencies and learning targets. And I know we're running short on time, but we certainly have blog posts about that. I certainly encourage anybody who wants to see what it looks like at the elementary level to go visit, because it's really wonderful. And the teachers that I spoke with there were absolutely thrilled. I think I should move us on to our last slide. Susan, were you trying to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you and go to wrap up, Ellie. So I'll turn it back over to you and just give a personal deep thanks to Damarr Smith. Damarr, to your work in Chicago Public Schools and your leadership, and then being willing to invest the time with the community here and sharing the work happening across the district and exciting across Illinois. So a deep thanks to you, and Eliot, I'll turn it over to you to do a wrap up. Thanks,
Susan, and again, echoing everything Susan just said, Damarr, it was really great to have you, and thank you so much for joining us. And we appreciate everyone joining us today, and for all of your excellent comments and questions in the chat box, and we will follow up on some of the ones that we were not able to answer during this time. The slide deck and the webinar recording will be available soon on our website, and we wish everyone good health, and the same to your families and communities, and thanks for joining us today. Take care, everyone.